Well, the super really is that house and.
Hello, welcome to our second speaker series for 2024. Last month, Brianna D'Agostino spoke. If you would like to watch her video, that is up on our YouTube channel. Today, our own Tia Antonelli will be speaking. Tia is a graduate student at Villanova University, currently pursuing her master's degree in history. She works at the Cumberland County Historical Society, both as the administrative assistant at the Lummis Library and a docent at the Gibbon House. And today she will be discussing rabies. Thank you, Tia.
Hi, everyone. So I'm very excited to be here. Just to give a little preface, I've been working on this research on and off for the past year or so, but I've added some things to our newsletters, and I didn't want to simply regurgitate that information for the speaker series, so I tried to find some new information, ask some new questions, get some new answers. So this is Man's Best Frenemy, Pets, Property, and Panic in 19th Century Cumberland County. So I wondered how exactly I wanted to start this presentation and where I wanted to take you guys. Because at first I was like, do I want to go chronologically? Do I want to go more by topic, similar to how I did with the newsletter, or what? And I figured the best solution was just to bring you to where I started with the research and how I came across this. So this is a piece from a Greenwich Township ticket, and the part that stuck out to me was the part I have circled. It says, quote, resolved that the township committee appoint a man to kill all dogs that the tax is not paid on when due. So this is from March 12th, 1895. And initially I'm wondering, what is going on? First question. Because this sounds absolutely bizarre to me. Of course, as an historian, I understand that cultural attitudes towards animals, topics, whatever, it's not the same as it is today, but dogs, why are we killing dogs? What's happening? So that brings me to the next two questions and the big ones. Why dogs and why are we killing them? So there are essentially two big factors for both of this. And that is hydrophobia and the panic before the creation and the development of a rabies vaccine, and also the attitude from farmers and the loss of their livestock and financial losses because of that. So before I go further, I want to do more information on what hydrophobia is, what I mean by that. So hydrophobia is essentially another term for rabies. In the 19th century, they were used a bit interchangeably. Hydrophobia was more so for animals, rabies more so for human infections. But again, they mean the same thing. And hydrophobia, the name, comes from one of the key symptoms of rabies, which is the fear of water. And this is bizarre because when you're infected with rabies, you have this insane thirst, you're parched, but your body has a physiological response that you just cannot drink the water. And that was one of the most notable symptoms in people, in animals, particularly dogs. So hydrophobia is the name. But there are plenty of other symptoms where that came from. Hydrophobia is notable for its tremors, the convulsions that victims suffer from. And in some cases, in many newspaper reports, you have these cases of people snarling like dogs after they've been infected, which sounds a bit insane and fictional, but there is a little bit of a scientific reasoning for that, and that's because of the convulsions. There's this idea that maybe the throat was experiencing these tremors, so when people would cry out, it sounded like a wolf's snarl. So I just wanted to bring this up because hydrophobia and rabies is terrifying disease. When I started this research, frankly, I had little to no information on it or idea of what it was. All I knew was that once symptoms developed, it was fatal. But in the 19th century consciousness, people were terrified of this disease because of what it could do to the human body. So, so just to go back, the two big reasons why dogs were targeted and why death was the biggest thing, it comes because hydrophobia was such a big, terrifying scare. And more than that, there was also farmers and the loss of their livestock. So this came a lot in the mid-19th century. In 1867, newspaper reported that the monthly report of the agricultural department noted $2.6 million in the United States for losses related to agricultural livestock. And in six counties of New Jersey, there were at least 400 cases of sheep being killed by dogs. These weren't cases of rabid dogs. These were just wild dogs going out and killing the livestock. So the reason why I'm looking at the two of these reasonings together is because looking at them together is the only way that dogs can, it illuminates the way that dogs were the ideal scapegoat for this issue. Because when it comes to rabies and hydrophobia, dogs weren't the only one who were the vectors for it. There were cases of cats going out and biting people, infecting them with rabies. Also, for at least a year, foxes were the biggest vector in the East Coast. So that alone wasn't enough to answer the question of why people were killing dogs, although certainly it was a big part. But ultimately, dogs became the ideal scapegoat for this fear of rabies and for this frustration in this agricultural sector, because they were the ones killing the livestock and they were the ones that people could point the finger to and say, you're rabid, you're inherently rabid. It's better for us to kill you than to experience loss or experience death in our own right. So that still adds some confusion. Can we just go back one more? Sorry. There's still some confusion. Forward one more, I'm sorry. Rabies has been around since ancient Greece, at least. There was a name for it in ancient Greece. So why is it that in the 19th century, this fear is coming up again and again and again? In my research, I found that in Cumberland County newspapers, the spike in mentions of hydrophobia as a term peaked in 1890. There was also, it started to increase in 1880, but its peak was in 1890, still high in 1900, but dwindled then. And that could be because the vaccine for rabies was developed in the late 1800s. But in looking at that, the increase in newspaper reports and newspaper mentions weren't necessarily hydrophobia cases or rabid dogs or animals in the area. It was just fear of it, how to combat it, how to cure it. But it wasn't like there were more cases. But still, regardless of the actual tangible evidence, you see this fear rising and seeping deeper and deeper into Cumberland County. So with dogs being the scapegoat and with this fear and this panic creeping in, we have these ideas of regulating dogs, and that leads to taxing dogs and then later hounds. So with dog regulation, there's a lot of discourse on the worth of dogs. Mostly they were considered, quote, worthless curs or fallen wolves in some cases, they were called. In newspaper reports, people awfully cruel to dogs did not like them. But in some cases, there were these ideas of good, innocent, well-mannered dogs, not like those worthless street curs. So there was this differentiation in good and bad dogs. So when it came to the actual regulation of them, muzzling seemed like a bare minimum. This idea that, okay, if you allow your dog to be out on the street, the least you can do is cover their faces. However, the ideas of regulation increased to the idea of killing, which we saw in Greenwich. And this idea and proposition for killing dogs, it didn't just happen in Greenwich, it happened in the greater Cumberland County area and also nationwide. There were reports of people killing dogs in Boston, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, all of these manners, a lot of it due to livestock losses and hydrophobia fears. But eventually, rather than regulating dogs with calls for muzzling or killing, because in most cases, these propositions would be brought but not enforced, eventually we see the creation of pounds. So the creation of pounds, it differed in time throughout Cumberland County. In Greenwich specifically, the pound was created a year after the call for a man to go out and kill all dogs. So we see that a man wasn't hired to go out and kill all the dogs. Instead, that led to the creation of pounds and pound keepers. Although, frankly, it's not always better with the pounds. So in the cases of pounds and pound keepers in late 19th century Cumberland County, the dogs were only kept for 3 days. And if they weren't claimed by the family, then the pound keeper would be tasked with killing the dog mercifully. And it was only 3 days. And the pound keeper would get paid for the number of dogs either reunited with the family or otherwise killed, for lack of better phrasing. So pound keeper seems like a better idea, kind of had the same outcome, essentially. And we see most of these debates with dogs and this fear of dogs and pounds and regulations in the press in Cumberland County. Most of what I found is from the West Jersey Pioneer, specifically from Bridgeton. But I also looked at the Evening Journal in Vineland. So with the very first quote on the right hand, for you, it's your left, sorry. This quote is in response to a rabid dog that was on the loose in Greenwich. This dog went into a blacksmith shop, almost bit the worker, and his apprentice didn't, but managed to bite a horse, and the death of that horse resulted in the loss of $100. So this quote is calling for the killing of all dogs so as to not run the risk of people being infected, because again, nobody wanted to experience the brutal death of hydrophobia, especially in the 19th century before the development of a cure. Most of these quotes are also leaning more anti-dog, leaning more to the regulation of dogs, either through muzzling or killing. There is one quote, though, at the very top that starts with PS. So this story was posted in the West Jersey Pioneer, and it was a fictional story about an English bulldog attempting to save a 6-year-old girl who was on fire. So her clothes were aflame, and this dog was attempting to pull her clothes off of her. The mom saw the dog, looked like it was biting the girl, freaked out, held her, and they eventually both burned. And the story claims that if the dog was able to keep working at it, it would be able to save the little girl. This story was put in the press explicitly because it framed dogs in a good light. So we see that people are having these debates on dogs, these debates on rabies, and what exactly we're supposed to do with them in the press and also in public policy. So despite most of it being hatred towards dogs, we also see that lots of people still loved them. It wasn't everybody who said, no, dogs are awful, we need to kill them. So on the right, we see this one quote. This was somebody discussing their anti-dog beliefs, also saying the dogs were a threat to livestock for fear of hydrophobia. But they also add that dogs are a great source of happiness to a class of women who lavish upon them. The petting which properly belongs to childhood is also undeniable. But then it would likely be a blessing if the dogs were exterminated and the affections thus compelled to run in a legitimate channel. So rabies was a big threat, livestock death was a big threat, and men were also jealous of dogs because women loved them too much. And one of these women, not from Cumberland County, but who I found in my research and was renowned nationwide, at least for her one article. The woman on your left, her name is Miss Minnie Manners from Lamberton, New Jersey. So this woman, first, she is a little bit different. This story is from 1909, but Basically this woman, she made a national appeal, a national claim saying, if you have a mad dog, send them to me. Don't send them to pounds to be killed. Don't kill them yourself. Send them to me. So Miss Minnie Manor, she was a wealthy heiress. Both of her parents were well off. They passed away when she was about 20 years old. So she was left to an entire estate and a wealthy fortune. So she flipped over her estate into an asylum for dogs. Her belief was that when people are old and sick, we take care of them and we give them asylum. Why are we treating dogs differently? They're not evil just because they're sick, which went against the general 19th century cultural consciousness that had this belief that dogs were more prone to being rabid. She said, no, they're just sick, they're innocent, so let me take care of them. And she hired on a veterinarian to work with her in her estate to take care of these dogs. So again, this story rose in national popularity, and it was likely because she was one of the few voices that was so pro-dog and was so bent on seeing dogs as innocent creatures who were simply sick. So where does this all lead us? This whole story of rabies and dogs and killing. We start with this ticket that says there's going to be a man going out and killing dogs. And what do we find out from it? So ultimately, policies ensuring the death of dogs, they became popular to appease the public responses to hydrophobia and livestock endangerment, excuse me. The two of them have to work hand in hand because without the two of them together, dogs are not the ideal scapegoat, as cats or foxes could be hydrophobic vectors and wolves could be killing livestock. But dogs were the ones who were running rampant in the city. The dogs were the ones who people were able to target and say, you could be taxed, you could be owned, you could be taken accountability for. You are going to be our scapegoat for this. And ultimately, hysteria and panic surrounding hydrophobia and rabies in the later 19th century, it came not necessarily as a consequence of local attacks and outbreaks, but because of these debates among citizens. We see in the late 1800s that there aren't necessarily more rabid dogs, rabid animals in Greenwich or even in New Jersey whatsoever. There are some few and far between stories of rabid dogs out in Kentucky, of rabid dogs out in Pennsylvania, nothing at home, but still the panic and the rising in the panic rising in the press. And most of it is because there's this debate happening amongst farmers, this loss of their livestock, this loss of their profit, and also local families. But ultimately, it wasn't people being attacked and people responding to those attacks. It was debates regardless of actual material evidence. And then just a brief little bibliography. So again, I've written a couple pieces in the newsletter for this, so most of my sources are already in there. I didn't want to add up a whole little slide, but yeah. Sorry, I feel like that was an awkward closing, but thank you. So, another reason why she proclaimed that she was such a good caretaker for these dogs was because she claimed to have been bitten 5 times. Again, this was after the vaccine had been created. So 2 of those times she said she didn't get vaccinated. She said for the other 3 she had. I will say it is unclear exactly what happened to her. Her name kind of fell off after this one single story, and rabies doesn't automatically appear. So unfortunately, she could have been infected, but we don't know for sure. But she claimed that she was immune. Yes.
When was the vaccine developed, and then when was it more widely available, say available in the county here? And
So-
then when do you know when laws came into effect saying that people had to have their dogs vaccinated?
Yes. So Pasteur came out claiming that he had created the vaccine in 1885, and then he started doing experiments in that year, actually on residents in New Jersey. He brought them back to Paris to do experiments, but it wasn't until the turn of the 20th century that it was actually more readily accessible. People were still having some debates on it, and in newspapers, people are still talking about other more folksy cures for rabies, but I would say around 1900s, 1910s, it became more widely accessible and more demanded for dogs to be vaccinated. Yes.
About, this.
So, in my work at the library, I sometimes do Facebook posts and blog posts. And to find the inspiration for that, I essentially go through our archives and look through the ephemera. So I just stumbled across that one ticket and I saw the piece that said, "We're gonna have a guy go out and kill these dogs." And I said, hold on. Hold on, what? It just was genuinely very jarring to me, again, because you see dogs as man's best friend, and I figured that throughout all of history, I mean, we domesticated them thousands of years ago, so we had to have liked them always, and seeing people say, no, kill them, very jarring, and I needed to know more. So I would say finding that a couple years ago just spurred me down this rabbit hole. Yes.
Your topic interested me because in doing family history research, I found that my second great grandfather, who was living in Germantown, Philadelphia, his Newfoundland made the newspapers in a big story. His Newfoundland was rabid. Did a number of dogs in the neighborhood. There was a call for a posse to come out with clubs and rifles, and they killed all the dogs that the Newfoundland had bitten. And then that kind of hysteria spread, and it went on to say that eventually then there was more rabies and that people went out and they clubbed the dogs to death. It was a horrifying story.
Yeah, in doing my research, I found that there were similar cases, like in Kentucky and Boston, it was big for some reason. And in Vineland, they mentioned, when they first proposed the idea of having a dog tax and muzzling dogs, it wasn't really enforced. And people complained in the press saying, well, we can't go out and do something about it because not enough people here own guns. We can't go and kill the dogs, but they wanted to. But yeah, and there was actually in the early 1900s, so a little bit after this hysteria was starting to calm down a bit, doctors came out and were saying that most deaths in this case weren't from hydrophobia, it was from people panicking so much because they assumed that every dog was rabid in some case. So essentially the doctors would say, if you think a dog is rabid, isolate it and then we'll see if the symptoms develop and then we'll know for sure. But if you're just killing the dog, you'll never know, and you'll just assume I'm infected, I'm going to die, rather than getting that clarity. So yeah, killing these dogs just causes more of the hysteria and the panic to spread. Yes.
A couple of the articles cited talk about make a distinction between registered and unregistered.
Yes.
So how common was registration of dogs in that time?
It really wasn't enforced or practiced, really. It was mentioned a lot in papers as this is the way to fix it, and it was proposed in multiple ways. The big one was having collars with tags on them that would distinguish this is a dog that had its tax paid, but a lot of people wouldn't actually go through with it, and the police and general public officials didn't otherwise enforce it. So it was brought up as the ideal way to combat this, but nobody really did it for some reason. But yeah, so that's also kind of why the Greenwich ballot ticket was such a big deal, because a lot of these calls for registration were brought up in press, just people saying, I want this to happen, please, let's enforce this, let's do this, not so much being brought up in the actual policy, if that makes sense.
Was there, did you notice any kind of political divide between like the political party who like cared about getting dogs registered or ones like I wasn't sure if there was any kind of political divide since it wasn't reinforced.
Yeah. I didn't notice too much of a like stark political divide. The big ones were more the people who were farmers or otherwise closely involved with those industries. It seemed more like an industry thing, more that I noticed with political party, but I will be honest, that wasn't like the top one. But mostly I saw it as a debate amongst farmers. And around this time, there was also the development of general animal protection societies. So you also see that attitude kind of shifting at the same time. But even in the debates of like registering dogs and things of that nature, it's interesting. You can see some people were very, very harsh saying, who cares? Just put the cage on the dogs, put the dogs in the cage, kill them. And then other people saying, hey, we can muzzle them, and like muzzling actually doesn't hurt them. It doesn't interfere with them. It's still, we're still treating the dogs nicely, and this is good for people. So even in those debates, you see like the cruelty and the kindness expressed by some people trying to get the same end goal. Yes.
Protection organizations begin, and was that related to this?
Off the top of my head, I cannot give you the year date. I know it was the end of the 1800s. I want to say 1880s, but please do not quote me. When they were developing and when they were gaining popularity, they did talk about rabies and hydrophobia, but I don't think it was necessarily connected to this issue.
Has rabies been in the past a bigger problem than it is now? Obviously, we have more control over it, but has it always been like a danger?
Yeah, it's mostly the changes with rabies, and what I notice is the most common vector of rabies. So, for instance, in the 19th century, dogs, cats, foxes, and now it's typically raccoons, bats, more of these wild creatures. And in the 19th century, I think it proposed more of a threat or seemed to propose more of a threat because of the developing of urban areas. And just kind of figuring out how dogs fit in these spaces, these geographical spaces. But I wouldn't say necessarily that it was more of a threat then, statistically, like with the material dog bites and attacks. I wouldn't say it was more of a threat then, but definitely the fear existed more in the cultural zeitgeist.
Any questions? Well, thank you
All
so much,
right.
Tia.
Thank you.
Keep your eye out for our next speaker series next month. Dr. Wendy Wilson from Rutgers University Camden will be coming to us. And there are lots of refreshments, so please help yourself. Thank you.
Yeah.